The myth of the flawless founding father dominates American consciousness through marble statues in rotundas, reverent speeches invoking their wisdom, and textbook heroism that transforms complicated humans into demigods whose decisions emerged from pure principle rather than messy reality of political compromise, personal ambition, and moral contradiction. The sanitized versions taught in schools present founders as unified visionaries who agreed on fundamental principles and whose personal lives reflected the ideals they articulated in documents that established American government. Then the curtain tears down when examining private correspondence, financial records, and personal relationships that founders hoped would remain hidden from historical scrutiny. Behind the parchment and glory were choices that contradicted public principles, fears that revealed human weakness beneath rhetorical confidence, betrayals of friends and family members whose loyalty conflicted with political ambitions, and contradictions they hoped history would forget through careful curation of public image and destruction of embarrassing documents. The men behind Marble were products of their era's assumptions about race, gender, and power, brilliant in some ways and blind in others, capable of articulating universal principles while denying them to people whose humanity they could not or would not fully recognize. Their genius lay not in perfection, but in creating system flexible enough to be improved by later generations, who could extend principles that founders proclaimed but incompletely applied. Understanding founders requires confronting their full humanity, acknowledging their intellectual achievements while recognizing their moral failures, appreciating their courage while examining their fears, celebrating their vision while documenting their blindness. The secrets they kept reveal that American founding was not inevitable triumph of virtue, but uncertain experiment conducted by flawed people whose personal struggles shaped institutions they created in ways that official histories obscure. Through focus on public achievements, rather than private contradictions that made their accomplishments simultaneously inspiring and troubling to modern sensibilities. The general who never slept suffered from constant illness during Revolutionary War, his physical health deteriorating under stress of command that aged him visibly over 8 years of campaigning, where defeat seemed more likely than victory, and where his decisions determined whether revolution would survive. Each crisis. Washington's private terror manifested in sleepless nights, spent worrying about supplies that never arrived, soldiers who deserted daily, and enemy forces that outnumbered his army while possessing superior training and equipment. Battlefield panic struck Washington despite his reputation for courage under fire, moments when he questioned whether he possessed ability to command armies in war, whose outcome would determine whether American independence was achieved or whether he would be remembered as failed rebel leader executed for treason. His fear was not cowardice but recognition of enormous responsibility he carried and devastating consequences that his mistakes would produce for thousands of soldiers who trusted his judgment. The army and nation could collapse at any moment through military defeat, financial exhaustion, or political fragmentation that would end revolution before independence was secured. Washington understood that Continental Army's survival was revolution's essential precondition, making every decision about whether to fight or retreat, advance or withdraw, potentially fatal to cause if he miscalculated enemy intentions or his own army's capabilities. His relentless fear drove cautious strategy that critics condemned as timid, but that preserved army through years when bold action might have achieved dramatic victories or catastrophic defeats that would have ended revolution permanently. The terror that haunted Washington's nights was not mentioned in public statements that projected confidence necessary for maintaining morale, creating gap between public image of composed commander and private reality of man consumed by anxiety about whether he was adequate to task history had assigned him. The private letters he hid revealed Washington's dread of mutiny among officers and soldiers who had not been paid in months, whose families were starving while they served in army that Congress seemed unable or unwilling to support adequately. Correspondence showing his fear of desertion documented daily loss of soldiers who concluded that dying for independence was less important than feeding their families, making Washington's army progressively weaker even when no battles were fought. letters sealed from public eyes for generations, contained admissions of weakness and expressions of despair that contradicted heroic image Washington carefully cultivated for public consumption. His correspondence with trusted confidants revealed moments when he doubted whether revolution could succeed, when he questioned his own leadership abilities, when he considered resigning command because burden seemed unbearable, and because he feared his continued leadership might doom cause through his inadequacies. Fear of assassination haunted Washington throughout war, as he recognized that British agents or disgruntled soldiers could kill him relatively easily, making his person vulnerable despite guards and security measures that attempted to protect Commander, whose death would have been a devastating blow to revolutionary cause. Several plots were discovered or rumored, creating atmosphere of suspicion where Washington could never be certain whether people around him were loyal or whether some might be waiting for opportunity to eliminate him. The correspondence he hoped would remain private showed human beings struggling with impossible burdens rather than marble hero calmly leading nation to inevitable victory. Washington's greatness lay partly in continuing, despite fears that would have paralyzed less determined person, in projecting confidence he did not always feel, in making decisions despite uncertainty that made every choice potentially catastrophic, demonstrating that courage means acting despite terror rather than feeling no fear. The idealist who lived a lie was Thomas Jefferson, whose soaring rhetoric about natural rights and human equality coexisted with lifelong entanglement in slavery system that he intellectually condemned but personally depended upon for maintaining lifestyle and paying debts that mounted. Throughout his life, Jefferson's towering brilliance produced Declaration of Independence and shaped American political philosophy, but his genius was undermined by fundamental contradiction between principles he articulated and practices he maintained at Monticello, where hundreds of enslaved people worked to support his household. Debt plagued Jefferson constantly as he spent beyond his means on books, wine, architecture, and hospitality that his plantation income could not support, making him dependent on credit that was secured by enslaved people whose sale would have been necessary to satisfy creditors if debts were called. His financial dependence on slavery made emancipation personally catastrophic, creating economic incentives that reinforced moral blindness about system whose injustice he acknowledged intellectually while participating in practically. Dependence on forced labor extended beyond economics to encompass daily existence, where Jefferson relied on enslaved servants for every aspect of domestic life, from cooking meals to maintaining buildings, to producing goods that plantation required for self-sufficiency. His brilliant mind that conceived democratic principles operated within material conditions created by human bondage, making his intellectual achievements inseparable from system of oppression that enabled leisure and resources necessary for philosophical work. The contradiction was not unique to Jefferson, but was characteristic of Virginia planter class that produced many founders, demonstrating how revolutionary ideals about liberty coexisted with economic and social structures built on slavery. Jefferson's failure to resolve contradiction through emancipating people he enslaved revealed limits of Enlightenment rationalism when applied to injustices that benefited those who recognized but could not relinquish their complicity in systems they knew were morally indefensible. The family he wouldn't name included Sally Hemings and children Jefferson fathered with enslaved woman who was property he inherited and who could not consent meaningfully to relationship with man who owned her. The hidden relationship lasted decades at Monticello, where Sally Hemings occupied ambiguous position as enslaved servant and mother of Jefferson's children, a duality that Jefferson never publicly acknowledged, despite rumors that circulated during his lifetime and that political enemies exploited to attack his character. Children he never publicly acknowledged included several who were freed during Jefferson's lifetime or after his death. Their light skin and resemblance to Jefferson, noted by contemporaries who understood what Jefferson would not admit that some of Monticello's enslaved population were his own children, condemned to legal status as property despite biological relationship to man who wrote that all men were created equal. The secret followed him to grave as Jefferson died without publicly recognizing relationship or acknowledging children whose existence contradicted carefully cultivated image as philosopher-statesman, above base passions and an opponent of racial mixing that he privately practiced. His silence about Hemming's family was deliberate erasure of people whose presence at Monticello was impossible to miss, but whose relationship to Jefferson was never officially documented in ways that would have made denial impossible for historians who later defended his reputation. DNA evidence and historical research eventually confirmed what Jefferson's contemporaries suspected, that relationship with Hemmings produced children, and that Jefferson's denials were lies of omission rather than full truth. The revelation demonstrated how founders' private lives contradicted public principles, and how historical memory was shaped through strategic silences about facts that would have complicated heroic narratives that American culture constructed around revolutionary generation, whose moral authority derived partly from erasing uncomfortable truths about their personal conduct. The patriot who feared democracy was John Adams, whose classical education convinced him that pure democracy inevitably descended into mob rule, where passions overwhelmed reason, and where demagogues manipulated ignorant masses to seize power that they would abuse tyrannically. His conviction that democracy would destroy America remained largely private, expressed in letters to confidants and in theoretical writings that never became campaign speeches or public declarations that would have alienated voters whose support Adams needed despite his contempt for their political judgment. Adams secretly believed that government required filtering popular will through institutions designed by educated elite who understood political theory and who could resist temporary enthusiasms that swayed voters susceptible to manipulation by unscrupulous politicians. His ideal constitution included checks on democracy through appointed officials, longer terms that insulated representatives from immediate popular pressure, and property requirements that limited voting to citizens with stake in social order and education to make informed decisions. Close confidants received Adams' frank assessments of democracy's dangers, his fear that equality would be interpreted as license for mob violence against property and established order, his concern that voters would choose leaders based on charisma rather than competence, his conviction that successful republic required virtuous citizens whose civic education most Americans lacked. These private opinions contradicted revolutionary rhetoric about popular sovereignty that Adams had supported publicly during struggle for independence. The contradiction revealed tension in revolutionary thought between idealistic proclamations about natural equality and practical concerns about whether ordinary people possessed wisdom to govern themselves competently. Adams's elitism was not unique among founders who publicly celebrated democracy while privately doubting whether it could work without guidance from educated class that would prevent mob rule from destroying liberty. That revolution had secured through sacrifices that Adams believed common people neither understood nor appreciated adequately. The laws he regretted were Alien and Sedition Acts passed during Adams' presidency in 1798, legislation that made criticizing government criminal offense and that gave President power to deport foreigners deemed dangerous to public safety. Adams's greatest shame stemmed from signing bills that violated principles of free speech and press that he had defended during Revolution, making him complicit in suppression of political opposition that contradicted Republican ideals he had spent lifetime promoting. His private writings explaining why he pushed legislation despite knowing it violated liberty revealed fear of French revolutionary influence, concern about domestic instability during quasi-war with France, and anger at newspaper editors who published vicious attacks on his character and policies. Adams convinced himself that crisis justified temporary restrictions on freedoms that would be restored once danger passed, rationalizing violation of principles through appeal to national security that has justified censorship throughout history. The acts destroyed Adams politically by confirming opponents' warnings that he harbored monarchical ambitions and that his administration threatened Republican government through authoritarian measures that punished dissent. Several editors were prosecuted under Sedition Act, creating martyrs whose persecution galvanized opposition and demonstrated how easily laws restricting speech could be abused to silence legitimate political criticism rather than protecting genuine security threats. Adams later acknowledged that supporting Alien and Sedition Acts was a mistake that damaged his reputation and undermined principles he had defended throughout revolutionary career. His private regret revealed understanding that fear had driven him to betray values he claimed to cherish, demonstrating how crises tempt leaders to sacrifice liberty for security through measures that seem justified by circumstances, but that establish dangerous precedents for future abuses by those less committed to eventual restoration of rights temporarily suspended. The founder who wanted throne was Alexander Hamilton, whose private ambitions included president serving life terms, hereditary Senate whose members would hold seats permanently and pass them to descendants, and powerful executive, bordering on monarchy with authority to veto state legislation and appoint state governors. Hamilton's vision for American government was fundamentally aristocratic, despite his personal rise from illegitimate birth and poverty, reflecting belief that effective government required concentrating power in hands of elite who would resist democratic pressures from ignorant masses. His proposals at Constitutional Convention shocked delegates who found them too reminiscent of British system that revolution had rejected, forcing Hamilton to moderate public positions while maintaining private conviction that republic required strong executive and Senate insulated from popular control. He argued that human nature required government by those whose wealth and education gave them stake in social order and capacity for rational decision-making that ordinary citizens lacked. Hamilton's fatal obsession with centralized authority stemmed from his experience during Revolution, when weak Continental Congress could not support army adequately, convincing him that diffused power meant paralyzed government incapable of effective action. His military background shaped authoritarian tendencies that made him uncomfortable with democratic processes he considered inefficient and dangerous, leading him to advocate for constitutional arrangements that would limit popular sovereignty while maintaining republican forms. The contradiction between Hamilton's public defense of constitution and his private preference for more monarchical system revealed that many founders supported final document, despite believing it was flawed compromise that gave too much power to states and people. Hamilton's advocacy for ratification, despite his reservations, demonstrated pragmatic recognition that perfect was enemy of good and that Constitution's centralizing features were best available alternative to weak confederation that preceded it, even if document fell short of his authoritarian ideal. His secret affair with Maria Reynolds began in summer 1791, when Hamilton, serving as Treasury Secretary, became involved with a woman who claimed her husband had abandoned her and who asked Hamilton for financial assistance. The relationship evolved into an affair that lasted over a year until James Reynolds, Maria's husband, discovered it and began blackmailing Hamilton through threats to expose scandal that would destroy his political career and family. Reputation. The blackmail that followed involved Hamilton making payments to Reynolds while continuing an affair with Maria, in arrangement that appears in retrospect as elaborate extortion scheme where both Reynoldses participated in defrauding Hamilton of substantial sums. The scandal was first major political sex scandal in American history, demonstrating that personal indiscretions could become political weapons when discovered by opponents seeking to destroy rivals' influence. Hamilton hid affair until forced to confess in 1797 when political enemies obtained letters documenting payments to Reynolds and accused Hamilton of using treasury funds for corrupt purposes. Rather than being exposed as corrupt official, Hamilton published pamphlet admitting to adultery while denying financial wrongdoing, choosing personal humiliation over professional disgrace by revealing that payments were blackmail rather than official malfeasance. The confession destroyed Hamilton's presidential ambitions and damaged his marriage, while establishing pattern where American politicians facing scandal must choose between private shame and public disgrace, often selecting lesser embarrassment that preserves some credibility. Hamilton's decision to admit adultery rather than face corruption charges demonstrated that even founders engaged in political calculations about which scandals were survivable and which would end careers completely, revealing that personal morality and political success were always intertwined in ways that made private conduct matter for public leadership. The American spy in London was Benjamin Franklin during years he spent in England before Revolution, when he conducted covert intelligence work while officially serving as colonial agent, representing Pennsylvania and other provinces. Franklin's espionage activities included stealing documents from British officials, intercepting letters that revealed government policies toward colonies, and manipulating British politics through strategic leaks and influence operations designed to advance American interests while maintaining his cover as loyal subject, seeking reconciliation between Britain and colonies. His years of intelligence work established networks of contacts who provided information about British military preparations, parliamentary debates, and ministerial decisions that Franklin transmitted to colonial leaders preparing for potential conflict. The double life required maintaining appearance of loyalty while working to undermine British authority, demonstrating skills in deception and manipulation that complemented his scientific achievements and diplomatic talents. Franklin intercepted letters exchanged between Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson and British officials, obtaining correspondence that revealed colonial government's complicity in British policies that Americans opposed. His decision to leak Hutchinson letters to Massachusetts patriots created scandal that destroyed Governor's credibility while exposing Franklin to British retaliation once his role was discovered, forcing him to flee England as revolution approached and his continued presence became untenable. The American spy's activities demonstrated that revolution was preceded by years of intelligence gathering and covert operations that shaped colonial understanding of British intentions and that prepared ground for armed resistance by ethically note, revealing that reconciliation was impossible when British officials privately advocated policies they publicly denied. Franklin's espionage contributed to revolutionary cause before fighting began by providing intelligence that informed colonial strategy and by compromising British officials whose exposed correspondence undermined their authority. The betrayals he buried included fractured relationship with his loyalist son William Franklin, who served as royal governor of New Jersey and who remained loyal to Crown throughout Revolution despite his father's prominent role in independence movement. The family feud that resulted from opposing political choices created permanent breach that Benjamin Franklin never fully forgave, demonstrating how revolution divided families and how personal relationships were casualties of political conflicts that made neutrality impossible once fighting began. Franklin's attempts at reconciliation with Britain before revolution alienated many colonists who suspected him of being British agent rather than American patriot, creating a situation where his diplomatic efforts to prevent war were misinterpreted as betrayal by people who wanted immediate separation rather than negotiated settlement. His commitment to exhausting peaceful options before embracing independence meant spending years working for reconciliation that ultimately failed, leaving him vulnerable to accusations of disloyalty from those who never believed accommodation was possible or desirable. William Franklin's refusal to resign as royal governor and join Patriot cause created public embarrassment for Benjamin Franklin, whose son's loyalty to Britain undermined his credibility as revolutionary leader. The personal pain of political estrangement was compounded by fact that William had been Benjamin's closest family member and political protégé, making his choice to remain loyal feel like personal rejection as well as political betrayal. The father-son relationship never recovered from Revolution's divisions, with Benjamin Franklin cutting William from his will and maintaining hostile distance until his death. The permanent breach demonstrated that Revolution's costs included broken families and that personal sacrifices made by revolutionary leaders extended beyond financial losses and physical danger to encompass destroyed relationships. With loved ones whose different political choices created unbridgeable divides that survived war, but killed relationships that had been central to both men's lives before politics forced them onto opposing sides. The quiet engineer of control was James Madison, whose fear that factions, states, and voters would tear country apart motivated his design of constitutional system that constrained democracy through checks and balances, limiting any group's ability to dominate national government. Madison's secret authorship of Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton provided intellectual foundation for ratification campaign, while concealing his identity through pseudonym Publius that protected him from immediate political backlash if arguments were rejected by voters suspicious of centralized power. His motive behind Federalist Papers was not just defending Constitution, but educating Americans about Republican government's requirements and dangers, creating lasting political theory that explained how large republic could avoid factionalism, that destroyed smaller democracies through institutional design that made tyranny by majority or minority difficult to achieve. Madison believed that Constitution's genius lay in mechanisms that forced compromise by preventing any faction from completely controlling government. Madison's hidden hand shaped constitutional provisions that limited state sovereignty, strengthened federal government, and created presidency with substantial powers, despite Revolutionary generation's suspicion of executive authority. His influence at convention exceeded his state's significance, because his preparation and political theory gave him authority that small states like Virginia's neighbors lacked, making Madison architect of a system that balanced competing interests through complex institutional arrangements that no single faction wrote, but that emerged from collective deliberation. Madison shaped through strategic interventions. The Quiet Engineer's work established American constitutional framework through combination of political theory and practical compromise, demonstrating that successful constitutions require both philosophical coherence and political flexibility. Madison's fear of factionalism proved prescient, as subsequent history revealed dangers he anticipated, vindicating his conviction that constitutional design mattered for preventing democratic government from destroying itself through majority tyranny or governmental paralysis when competing interests could not compromise on policies. Advancing national welfare. The edits that changed America occurred when Madison revised Jefferson's draft of Bill of Rights during First Congress, altering language and structure in ways that changed meaning of protections for individual liberty, while leaving Jefferson's name associated with document, despite Madison's authorship of final version. The private changes Madison made included narrowing some protections Jefferson envisioned, eliminating provisions he considered unworkable or politically problematic, and restructuring amendments to focus on individual rights rather than structural limitations on federal power. Madison's alterations demonstrated that Bill of Rights was product of legislative compromise rather than single author's vision, with final text reflecting concerns of multiple constituencies whose support was necessary for ratification but whose demands sometimes conflicted with each other. His editorial decisions shaped American liberty by determining which rights received constitutional protection and how broadly those protections extended, making Madison's choices about wording and structure consequential for subsequent interpretation by courts and political leaders. Leaving Jefferson's name on pedestal as Bill of Rights author was historical inaccuracy that simplified narrative about documents' creation while obscuring Madison's central role in drafting amendments that Congress approved and states ratified. The misattribution served political purposes by associating protections for liberty with Jefferson's already established reputation rather than with Madison, whose support for Constitution made him suspect to anti-federalists, demanding stronger protections against federal power. The edits revealed that American founding documents were products of political processes involving multiple authors and extensive revisions, rather than inspired texts emerging fully formed from single genius. Understanding how Bill of Rights was actually created demonstrates that constitutional protections result from political compromise and strategic choices about language rather than from philosophical purity, making Madison's editorial work essential to creating amendments that could achieve supermajority support necessary for constitutional ratification. The president who nearly lost everything was James Monroe during Panic of 1819, when financial collapse threatened to destroy economy and his presidency through combination of bank failures, falling land values, and credit contraction that created widespread unemployment and foreclosures. Monroe's internal panic stemmed from recognition that economic crisis could trigger political upheaval, undermining national government and destroying union through sectional conflicts over economic policies that affected regions differently. The financial crisis resulted from speculation bubble in Western lands, overextension of credit by state banks, and Second Bank of United States policies that suddenly contracted money supply in effort to restore financial stability, but that triggered recession instead. Monroe lacked economic theory or policy tools to address systemic crisis, making him largely helpless observer as economy collapsed despite his symbolic authority as president, whose powers did not extend to managing financial markets or compelling banks to lend. His presidency nearly collapsed under weight of crisis that exposed federal government's limited capacity to respond to economic disasters, and that created political opposition demanding policies that Monroe believed would worsen problems rather than solving them. The panic revealed tensions between agricultural and manufacturing regions, between debtor and creditor interests, and between those favoring strong federal intervention and those demanding that government avoid economic management entirely. Monroe's survival of crisis owed more to economic recovery's eventual arrival than to any policies he implemented, demonstrating that presidential reputation often depends on factors beyond executive control. His silent crisis never became a defining feature of historical memory, despite being most serious domestic challenge his administration faced, suggesting that economic disasters are forgotten more easily than military conflicts when they do not escalate into political catastrophes that fundamentally restructure government or society. The doctrine he never claimed was Monroe Doctrine, most of which was crafted in secret by John Quincy Adams, serving as Secretary of State, while Monroe took credit to unite fractured nation behind foreign policy that asserted American influence over Western Hemisphere. The shocking truth that Monroe did not write document bearing his name revealed that presidential pronouncements often reflect cabinet members' work rather than chief executives' personal authorship, making attribution of policies to presidents historically misleading when advisors actually shaped content and language. Adams drafted warning to European powers against colonizing Americas or interfering with independent Western Hemisphere nations, articulating principle that became foundation of American foreign policy for next century, despite being announced as Monroe's presidential message. The doctrine's significance emerged gradually, as later administrations invoked Monroe's pronouncement to justify intervention in Latin America, making statement that seemed relatively minor in 1823 become cornerstone of American hemispheric dominance by century's end. Monroe took credit deliberately to strengthen presidential authority and to unite country behind foreign policy that enjoyed broad support across partisan divisions, demonstrating political calculation behind decision to present Adams's work as presidential doctrine rather than as Secretary of State's proposal. The attribution served national interest by giving policy presidential imprimatur that carried more weight internationally than bureaucratic recommendation would have possessed, even though substance was identical, regardless of whose name attached to it. The truth about Monroe Doctrine's authorship was known to insiders, but concealed from public, who credited Monroe with vision that actually belonged to Adams, creating myth that served political purposes, even though it misrepresented how policy was actually created. The deception was accepted practice in administration, where cabinet officers drafted documents president would sign, making collective authorship normal rather than exceptional, but allowing presidents to claim credit for work they supervised rather than personally performed. The shadows that built the light emerged from examining founders' secrets, fears, and contradictions that humanized marble figures while complicating heroic narratives about American founding. The central truth becomes inescapable. America was shaped not just by founders' virtues of courage, intelligence, and commitment to Republican principles, but equally by their fears of democracy and disorder, their contradictions between proclaimed ideals and lived practices, and their secrets about personal conduct that violated standards they publicly endorsed. The founders weren't gods who descended from Olympus to create perfect nation through pure reason and selfless virtue, but were humans whose brilliance coexisted with blindness, whose principles competed with prejudices, whose public lives contradicted private conduct in ways they hoped history would ignore through selective documentation and strategic silences. Their humanity made their achievements more remarkable rather than less significant, demonstrating that flawed people can create institutions and articulate principles that transcend their personal limitations. Humanity, not perfection, built country through messy political processes where competing interests forced compromises, where personal ambitions shaped constitutional provisions, where fear of failure motivated innovations in governmental design, and where moral contradictions about slavery and democracy coexisted with genuine commitments to liberty and self-governance. The founders' greatness lay in creating a system flexible enough to be reformed by later generations, who could extend rights that founding era denied to women, enslaved people, and others excluded from full citizenship. Understanding that founders were human rather than mythological liberates contemporary Americans to acknowledge their contributions while recognizing their failures, to appreciate their wisdom while learning from their mistakes, to honor their memory while demanding that America live up to principles they articulated but incompletely realized. The shadows they cast make the light they created more precious because it emerged from struggle and compromise rather than from inevitable progress or divine intervention, proving that human determination to build better society can succeed despite imperfect people and incomplete understanding of justice that time and experience gradually illuminate. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.